everyone. On behalf of the Center for the Living City and Marywood University School of Architecture, we welcome you to the kind of opportunity a post-COVID city is. We have an exciting conversation with Michael Kimmelman, led by Roberta Brandes Gratz. Michael Kimmelman has been the New York Times architectural critic since 2011. His work focuses on urban affairs, public space, housing for the poor, infrastructure, social equality, and the environment, as well as on design. A best-selling author, he has won numerous awards over the years and been praised for his insight, candor, and continuous scrutiny of New York's architectural environment. From 2007 to 2011, Mr. Kimmelman was based in Berlin, covering Europe and the Middle East. He has reported from more than 40 countries and twice been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. While based in Berlin, he reported on life under Hamas in Gaza, the crackdown on culture in Putin's Russia, negritude in France, and bullfighting in Spain, among other subjects. He was previously the Times' longtime chief art critic. He is a graduate of Yale and Harvard, adjunct professor at Columbia University, former Frank Fellow at the Whitney Center for the Humanities at Yale, and a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books. Michael, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Mariz. Very kind.
This conversation will be led by our own Roberta Brandes Gratz. She is an award-winning journalist and urban critic, international lecturer and author. Her most recent book is It's a Hell of a Town, Joan Kaplan Davidson and the J.M. Kaplan Fund and Fight for a Better New York. Voted one of Planet Zine's top 100 urban thinkers in 2011, she is also the author of 5 other books on urban change. Ms. Gratz is widely credited for coining the term urban husbandry and illustrating in her writing how urban regeneration works in actuality, rather than just in theory. She served from 2003 to 2010 on the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission, leaving for an appointment to the Mayor's Sustainability Advisory Committee. In 2005, in collaboration with Jane Jacobs, Stephen Goldsmith, and Margie Ziegler, Ms. Gratz founded the Center for the Living City to build on Ms. Jacobs' work. This was the culmination of several years of discussion with Ms. Jacobs about building on her legacy. Roberta, thank you so much for leading this conversation.
My pleasure.
We are your hosts. We are the Center for the Living City. I am Maria McDonald, the Executive Director of the Center for the Living City. Behind the scenes is Chelsea Gauthier, our Associate Director. We are going to disappear, and Roberta is going to lead a conversation with Michael. Please feel free to chat along in the Q&As. Tell us where you're joining us from, and we will be following along. And then we'll stop about 45 to 50 minutes from now and take some more questions and answers from you directly. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
First of all, I want to welcome professor friends of mine who are in Vienna and Delft and sharing conversation with their students. So we are international today. Thank you, Michael, for doing this. You've been a great friend for the center, and I know we have a lot to talk about. So let's start.
Sure.
A couple of years ago, you gave a Jane Jacobs lecture in which you portrayed a very futuristic city ahead of us. At the time, the rage was driverless cars. Now it's electric cars, but they are all still cars. Where do we see New York and other cities going with this? Is it a distraction from the real need for mass transit? And how does this relate to changes that we see in Penn Station, the Port Authority, the airports, maybe Gateway Tunnel finally? What does this all portend?
Well, it's good to talk with you, Roberta, and that's a big question. So let me see how I can begin. I guess I would say that going back to what I was talking about a couple of years ago with driverless cars, the there's a lot of hope that somehow technology will solve the problems of the city, but I think it's important to say that we need to solve our own problems, and the technology won't solve them for us. My hope about driverless cars at the time was really a provocation about the fact that we can rethink the city in dramatic ways, and I think that is exactly what's happening now. What COVID has done for the city is to show that we can make change at a much more rapid clip and in a much more dramatic way than we thought, and that it takes a will. It's not a problem of even legislation. It's really a question of people coming together around the right issues. The issue with driverless cars was, can we reimagine our streets? Can we try to imagine a city that is less car-centric, that is less, that devotes less space to curbside parking? I don't think people realize just how much, even New Yorkers, how much of the city is given over to cars. I mean, about 15 central parks are given over just to curbside parking alone. It's about a Manhattan and a half. So, we have to say, one of the questions about driverless cars is, could we eliminate a good number of cars? And, that is part of this question of, can we reimagine our streetscape? And we have to go back to the fact that the city was not always designed to look this way. Cars were not the original, conception of the grid. And again, I come back to this, during COVID, we've seen this rather remarkable overnight transformation that for years, it was a bloodbath to try to negotiate with community boards and resistant car owners and their lawyers to liberate, in effect, 3 or 4 parking spaces in order to create a bike lane or a rapid bus lane overnight because of COVID and because of the need to create both spaces for restaurants and businesses that couldn't operate indoors, but also to create space for people to go outdoors. We granted 10,000 permits to restaurants to open spaces curbside, and did free up about 10 to 15,000, the number's a little vague, but parking spaces, and some 82 miles of streets to turn them into pedestrian streets. So that tells us that we can do this at scale. And I think this is the moment. I mean, COVID, it's very often in the history of New York that it is a crisis, a time of economic crisis or social or other crisis that has provided essentially the tinder to spark large-scale reimagining of the city. We saw that, obviously during the Depression. Rockefeller Center was born at the depths of the Depression. Lincoln Center, the depths of, white flight and problems in the early 60s. The Cornell Tech campus on Roosevelt Island came directly out of the crisis in 2008. And I think, now we have this opportunity and need really to rethink what the city looks like. So I'm optimistic about that. I'll shut up, but you did raise this very important question, which is to what extent we're talking about streets and cars and electric cars or whatever. And of course, I take your point, which is that we need fewer cars, not more, whether they're electric or otherwise. But it is about transit, how we get around the city. And so this is a moment that we are rethinking our major transit hubs and the infrastructure that supports them. And I think for the first time in some years, we have the possibility of an administration in Washington and an incoming administration in New York that will make this a centerpiece of economic improvement and reconsideration of the city. So I think that's really the center of where change will be happening in New York in the coming years.
Well, it's interesting because if you look at Penn Station, which I don't know that it's done much to actually change transportation, but access to the trains is highly improved in a wonderful landmark building. And the Port Authority plan to rebuild, and the airport's in process, and God willing, Gateway Tunnels. So those are the big pieces.
Right.
But I don't know if you've seen, I certainly haven't seen anything that focuses as well on basically the transit of getting around the city. If anything, we've escaped some cuts that were expected during COVID. But you think it's possible that now that focus will be stronger?
Well, let's unpack some of that. So Penn Station, of course, the opening of the Moynihan train hall is the first step to what needs to be a much more robust and complex series of transformations around that area that include the building of a whole other station, Penn South, and the renovation of the existing decrepit underground, Rat's Maze famously. But as part of that, that has to be integrated with, I think, a new streetscape, improvements to bus and train, subway access, and to bikes, and the pedestrianization of a lot of that area. That I think is really the larger picture of what needs to happen around there, and may. The train hall is crucial because it provides what you might call proof of concept, that we can make change, and that change has a meaningful role in the lives of millions of people. People will want more of the same once they see this. And I think that sense of helplessness and decades of inaction are countered by this idea that we have this thing now, so we want more of it. And it needs to be said that in order for the economics of the city to improve, we need to bring back people who are now working remotely but work in offices around the city. And part of that is improving the commute, making their arrival in the sense that they are not suffering Penn Station's underground hell. So I think that is part and parcel of a much larger picture. Now, as for what you're describing, which is the MTA and buses and so forth and bikes, look, I think the MTA is its own complicated subject, which we can't get into too much here. But the MTA is a mess, and we need to get a handle on this. And obviously, like NYCHA, it's one of these unimaginably enormous problems. And we seem to have avoided the re-election of a president who was not going to provide any support, and therefore we now have at least the opportunity to avoid some of those huge cuts. But some of the big ideas about what to do in coming years involve, for instance, bike lanes on the late, but finally our mayor has come around to the idea that we needed to put bike lanes on bridges and to create a more connected network. And there are great ideas out there. Sam Schwartz put out his own provocation with a team this summer, which I wrote about, to imagine bike and pedestrian bridges, new bridges that would actually connect from Queens and Brooklyn to Manhattan. And that is part of the streetscape. That is part of getting rid of cars. It's not only about subways. The thing is, we need to do this in a way that really thinks this through all the way. You don't just build this, you have to think about what kinds of bikes there are. Do you have e-bikes so that commuters in underserved, distant areas who are now relying on subways or have a 2 or 3 stop two or three vehicle trip to get to their jobs, can they have an alternative with, say, e-bikes, and is that plausible? And that's a long, but I think now a conversation we can begin to have, especially if the next mayor is somebody who's focused on this, and some of the candidates clearly are.
So I totally agree with you, and I would say that it is cause for optimism. I mean, here we see we've been through this deadly period, and yet we have more bike lanes than ever. We lost 15,000 parking spaces. We have all this great restaurant. So nobody can say to us, this is not possible. We've seen what's really possible.
Yeah.
And that's,
I think, I'm sorry, Roberta, I was going to say, I think, look, one of the responses to this is people have been afraid to go in the subways. More people bought cars. There's more demand for parking than before, not for subways. This sort of thing. And you put your finger on it, I think, which is, look, it turns out that, we took away 15,000 parking spots. The sky didn't fall. Some of those parking spots went to businesses in underserved areas, which never had the ability to function outdoors, not just during COVID, but period, changing the life of streets in some areas, which is a great thing. So I think, yes, there are more people with cars. That doesn't mean we have to build the city around them. And it doesn't mean that that habits won't gradually be restored. I take the subway. I understand the stresses that are involved with taking it nowadays. I've had my share of uncomfortable moments on the subway in the last year. But the truth is that taking the subway is unquestionably the only way this city works for millions and millions of people. And I think, I think people will go back to that. I don't think we need to accommodate more cars because at this moment, some people who can afford it have decided that they're going to buy one for COVID. I think, that's a luxury or a problem that they will have to cope with. I'm not hostile to the notion that, there are uses to cars during a crisis like this, but we have to think much farther down the line than this.
right. It's their dilemma to deal with, not the city's dilemma to solve. So let's switch gears for a minute, and let's talk about the South Street Seaport. I have a feeling you and I see some of this slightly differently, but the museum of the seaport, it's one of the oldest sites in the city, and it's struggled from the days of its establishment in the 1960s. And now it is threatened, I feel, by yet another cataclysmic, to coin a Jane Jacobs phrase, development proposal that is similar to overscaled proposals all over the city, despite the shrinking office market and the primary need for truly low-income housing. So how does this relate to the dramatic move to upzone historic districts like Soho and the whole issue of landmarking? I mean, this is a real conflict. And from my point of view, somehow the target is always the historic districts, which I point out, developers always oppose when they're coming up for designation. And then they're like predators. Once the success is there, they want to cash in and build what they want at whatever scale. So where does the seaport fit into this larger picture?
So for those people on this call who are, from Delft and abroad, who might not even know what the seaport is, and I think for a large number of New Yorkers, the sort of the details of this particular situation are really in the weeds of New York, and I'll try to I think I'm going to write about this shortly, so it's in my head too. But I'll try not to get too lost in those weeds. But you raise lots of issues. I don't entirely agree. Sorry, I had a light here, so much my light is going on off because it's a dark room otherwise. I'll leave it. I don't entirely agree that in this particular case, the development is a development is a violation of everything you and I believe in, Roberta. But let me get to that. So this is an interesting case for much broader reasons. You have a site which was, as you say, created as a historic district. It's these 19th century, it's the last remaining buildings from what was the port of the 19th century. And created there was a museum, the South Street Seaport Museum, with the idea that to support the museum, you would have a development. At that time, it was a development based on the sort of festival site like Faneuil Hall in Boston or whatever. I won't get into all the financing problems, but let's just say it catastrophically did not work. Famously, catastrophically did not work. And it raises one very large issue, which is the essential neoliberal way in which we have dealt with things like historic preservation, with affordable housing. It's often somehow tied to the idea that if it's profitable to somebody, then we'll eke out some public benefits on the back of those profits. That's a crude way of putting what happened at South Street Seaport. And I'm not against all public-private ventures by any means, but in that case, it didn't work. So you had a failing museum and a site that has on it essentially an empty lot, an acre-sized parking lot that abuts all of the rest of the development downtown, which are tall buildings and whatever, and has therefore next to a lot of buildings which are not at all like the little group of historic buildings that the district preserves. What's interesting about this is that that parking lot is not a really, it has no historic value. And the community around there doesn't want a big building to go up there. The proposal, and there have been, I think you said this too, when you were on the Landmarks Commission, you had some proposals. I think there have been at least 9 proposals over the year. 4 of them have been considered by the Landmarks Commission. 3 rejected, 1 permitted, which was never built, to put a 12-story structure. The proposals that have come up recently, the first one was for some 80-story building. And in the way that these proposals often work, each proposal gets a little smaller and a little smaller, and all the sort of bells and whistles get smaller and smaller to try to find that place where maybe the Landmarks Commission will be okay, and the developer is still making money, and there are enough sort of benefits for everyone to feel good about it. In this case, the offers of the developer have included a larger proportion of affordable apartments, of subsidized apartments, than the city requires. And this is an area that could use more affordable housing. I have talked to probably some people on this call who might disagree that there's affordable housing on the other side of the Brooklyn Bridge, just a little north, but this particular area does not really have it, and actually I think could use more residential development and certainly more affordable housing. And also that the development would provide the museum, which is basically on the verge of collapse financially, with money, so that the museum could build an endowment and do some renovations and get itself back on its feet. So the idea is the developer saying, we will support the museum and therefore the district, and we will provide extra affordable housing, in return for which we can build this larger building than the neighbors want and larger than the Landmarks allows. Okay, that's probably a lot in the weeds, but here's my general remark, and then we can debate it or whatever. One of the questions, I think that the larger question about heritage, landmarks, and so on, and it comes up in many cases when we're talking about landmarking, is what the landmarks law was created to save buildings, but also with a larger goal of preserving the culture of the city, the heritage of the city, and it's defined in a much broader way than just architecture. Though the commission is really only allowed to think about whether something belongs in a kind of vague way, but whether it belongs architecturally, historically, fits. I think one could say that there's an argument. I'm not arguing for this particular project, but I'm saying, what is it that we want to preserve? We want to preserve that historic district. We may want to preserve the museum. We want also to create a community and an environment that is consonant with the culture of the city, which we believe is healthy. And that on that site, I think would be a more economically diverse and robust residential community. So one could argue in the abstract that we want something like more housing to be built on that site. And do we want alternatively to keep that as an empty parking lot because it doesn't conform to the landmarks designation and to the zoning that the community had established some years ago? In other words, there can be a tension in our thinking about this between the literal law and the notion of what fits within the historic district and what we really want to preserve. You know, this came up when I was thinking about, it comes up all the time, I think, but it came up in my mind when I was thinking about the Strand bookstore, whose owner didn't want the building preserved because she didn't want interference from the city if she planned to do anything in the bookstore. But she raised an interesting point. I thought that building should be landmarked, and it was. But she raised an interesting point, which was effectively, what is it that we are doing when we preserve that building? I mean, yes, maybe we wanted to preserve that building, but not that wasn't really the issue. The issue was we didn't want the Strand to go away. The Strand is the thing that represents the cultural heritage and the values that we don't want to be destroyed by new development. And how can we get back essentially to the fundamental way we talk about preservation and heritage, to include those things which are not technically included in the landmark law, but really are what we mean when we talk about preserving our neighborhoods. And I'm going to stop now, but I'll just say, during COVID, you have had many restaurants and businesses and local bodegas and whatever that have gone under. Those things are part of the lifeblood and identity of the communities. And, you know, we have a totally, you know, capitalistic way of looking at supporting businesses and the way in which the city can or will not support, help to support struggling businesses like that. But I would say what we really want is to make sure those things are not lost. And how can we talk about preserving that, not just the container, which may or may not be architecturally significant? Okay, that's my little speech.
Well, why shouldn't we have a little bit of disagreement?
Yeah, I'm not saying, by the way, I don't think the proposals for that site as they've moved along are architecturally spectacular. So I can't, and I'm not saying even that the deals that are being offered are entirely worth it. So I'm not advocating for the developer in this case, but I think the discussion is an important one we need to have.
So, it's interesting because the issue, one of the things what you're really talking about is the preservation of the city's culture.
Right.
And you're right, that's not what landmark preservation law is about, although in recent years, and this is since I've been on the commission, not so much while I was there have been some designations that have been as cultural as they are historically architectural. However, what it also means is that in the case of Strand, designation, that issue, and it really surprised me because that issue was resolved in court years ago. There was nothing that prevented her from pursuing change to her building. It was just that it would be change that would be accommodated by the designation, and it would have to be approved through landmarks. But I think the issue is larger. For example, and I've mentioned this to you and to many people, I watched while I was on the commission, enormous change in Soho, a designated historic district. New buildings, very contemporary, and some in the village too, for which I was, criticized by villagers because I voted for contemporary buildings in the historic context. And Soho has undergone great change. What we're talking about here, and I think it's true at the Seaport, and I resent the groups who want to say that preservationists are against change. That's absolutely hogwash. It's a matter of what's appropriate change. And in this case, what we're seeing is not the kind of change that really addresses our housing issues, such as the legalization of basement apartments, the secondary unit approval in single family districts. I mean, with all the upzoning, the districts in the city, in Brooklyn and Queens and elsewhere, that are single family homes, they were downzoned. Why do they get to escape their assumption of some of the burden? So the question is not, should there be change? And I agree with you that parking lot at the Seaport, as well as many other places, are appropriate for new development. And I would say, I don't speak for all preservationists, but I would say the majority of preservationists would tell you, yes, but what's appropriate?
Right.
And we've reached a point in this city where that question is really front and center, because we're inviting in Soho buildings that may be, they could go up to 50, 60 stories, and Soho's just the beginning. Is that appropriate for the historic districts of the city? We want the layering, and that's why I enjoyed approving, at least voting for, some new contemporary architecture in Soho, in the Village, and other districts. But they were in scale, even though they were bigger than the predominant scale. They weren't overwhelming. They weren't cataclysmic. And in this city, I don't know, we've reached a point of no return. Developers will not think of anything less. I mean, look at what's happening on both sides of Grand Central. Now the new one to replace the Commodore is what, 83 stories? And the one that's either finished or the SL Green one
Yeah,
is
one Vanderbilt is much, it's 1,300 feet or something, I forgot, yeah.
something, incredible.
Yeah.
Is this what we have to look for in a city where the office space is shrinking, the office use is shrinking because of COVID and other changes? And maybe we should shift to the idea of converting some of these old office buildings to housing, but it wouldn't change the inclination that seems to be throughout the city for an extreme scale of change.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many issues here, and it's hard to know where to begin with this. I certainly agree with you about having auxiliary units and the conversion of garages and stuff. And this is a no-brainer, and I think there is a lot of support for that. And I think um, that is not, that can't be the alternative to other kinds of development when we need a lot of housing, but it is certainly a useful step. And not just in New York, by the way. This is a conversation that's being had all across the country, Minneapolis and
Right.
Los Angeles and San Francisco and so forth. So there are certain low-hanging fruit that certainly need to be picked, and then we get back to some of what you're saying, which is what do we do in those areas like Soho, where the historic integrity of that neighborhood comes up against both political and social pressures to share the burden of increasing the amount of affordable housing. So, there are different cases here, right? So part of the development you're talking about around Grand Central has to do with an idea born in the Bloomberg administration to upzone Midtown East in order to replace a lot of those no longer up-to-date office buildings along, say, Park Avenue and around Grand Central. And that's, to me, not entirely okay, but makes more sense than some of the other developments because it's transit-oriented development if it's hand in hand with improvements to Grand Central and the subways and so forth, and to the public realm. There are arguments that if you're going to build large office buildings, let's put aside the economic logic of doing that at the moment, that would be a place to do it. Upzoning in Soho has to do with this desire, I think, that to see that areas which are wealthier, and Soho is next to the South Street Seaport, by the way, I think that has the highest per capita income in the city for a neighborhood, that it shares with areas, underserved areas in the city where a lot of rezoning has been focused, some of this responsibility to provide more affordable housing. So this comes up against this larger question, which Jane Jacobs was not dealing with. The climate is so different now than it was, when she was describing places like the Village, my neighborhood where you lived as well, and that is that we have at this point such inequity in the city and such distrust of this neoliberal idea of how the city should be built, and essentially handing so much of handing the city keys over to developers with the idea that the public ekes out some benefits from the profits of the developers, that has come up against the failure to provide enough affordable housing to really maintain the city in a way that functions for working people. And so almost all development now seems like a potential threat. And this has created, I think, an alliance between people who don't necessarily want new development in their neighborhood. I'm going to not use the word NIMBY, but people who want to preserve their neighborhood as it is, and also tenant activist groups that fear displacement, fear new development of any kind is going to mean essentially higher costs in their neighborhood and possibly that they'll be displaced. This is a potentially very dangerous position for the city to be in, because if all development is seen as a threat, then making the changes we talked about at the beginning is extremely difficult, if not impossible. And there are examples, I can give you them, of places in the city where affordable housing has been a large portion of the proposal, and the neighborhood has turned, which needs affordable housing desperately, affordable is a weird word, but subsidized housing, lower than, subsidized housing. And the fact that there's some market rate housing has killed the whole project. Let us remind ourselves that at South Street Seaport, again, I'm not defending that, but the developer has the right to put a building there, the 12-story building, with only market rate apartments in it, or only sell it to Google, rent it out to Google or something. There's no obligation to provide a single affordable unit. So that's, again, I'm not using that as the best example, but this is the dynamic we often find ourselves with. A city which is increasingly unaffordable and therefore non-functional. And yet, we find ways to thwart developments that might provide us with more affordable housing or support for cultural institutions like the South Street Seaport. We have to have a conversation in public that engages everyone and thrashes out these issues in a way that rebuilds trust, because that's, I think, what's fundamentally missing. We don't trust developers for whatever reasons, maybe good ones in many cases. We don't trust the city to protect us. We don't, if there are new ideas about ways we can provide more affordable housing or fix night charges, there's always been resistance in New York. That's part of our health, but it can get to a point where we are really paralyzed. And this is a moment we cannot afford that to happen. We need to have big ideas and tackle things in an ambitious way. One of them is to say, yes, can we convert some of these buildings? It's environmentally a good idea. It's a way, therefore not destroying these buildings, but it's a way of diversifying neighborhoods. The governor has talked about this and others have. There's an article in New York Magazine my friend Justin Davidson did, in which he got somebody to hypothetically, imagine these buildings, some of these buildings like the ones along Park Avenue in the, in Midtown reimagined. I think it's economically very complicated. It involves a lot of new zoning and other regulations, but sure, that has got to be part of the equation. We need all these things on the table.
No doubt. I guess I'm among those who don't trust either the city or the developers to join that conversation in any way but through their total lens. Whereas I've seen localities be more open to change, just not necessarily the change that developers want. And I don't see the city doing what it can do that doesn't involve developers. Why does all change have to involve developers?
Yeah, so this is the neoliberal problem, right? So why have we created a system where everything has to depend upon private profits? Now, that said, there are many examples, and I'm thinking of a few lately, and some of them concern NYCHA, for instance, where private involvement has produced results that the public, that the city and the feds have not been able to produce. And that's really meaningful. That if you're living in a NYCHA project where you cannot, where you've had mold and leaky roofs and nobody answering your call for months and just crime and all sorts of other problems, if someone comes in there, renovates everything, makes the place work, provides maintenance and a staff to support you, are we supposed to say no because it's a private entity? I think if there are protections for residents and there's a kind of really public-minded and still public-controlled system, maybe that is something we need to consider, and that's one of these programs. So, it's very complicated. But it comes out of a question of, as you say, can we trust the city? Can we trust developers? I think that trust comes from conversations that are much more up front, let's get back to the South Street Seaport, for example. I don't mean to, again, pick on this site, but if we actually knew what could be built there, at what scale, that would still, let's say, make some profit for the developer. So instead of saying that developer is now offering maybe $50 million to the museum and 100 affordable apartments at X height, but we knew the end game of this, and that actually at 15 stories, they could do 40 apartments and 100 million for the museum, or all affordable or something, we would be having conversations much more honest. But what we do instead is play this game where nobody really trusts the other. Everyone feels like they're gaming the system to try to get the most they can out of it. And I think that just creates this atmosphere in which you're not even supposed to feel that the conversation is honest. You're supposed to sort of have this system of resistance. And, you know, the way to overcome that is to begin from the beginning about what the needs are, the desires of the community, what the competing desires are of developers, the larger city, as well as the local community. And, you know, begin to thrash this out. I'm not saying it solves everything, but I do think, you know, we're stalled with a lot of conversation. So I get back to Penn Station. Last thing I'll say is something like Moynihan is important, not because it solves Penn Station's problems. It doesn't. It solves a small portion of them, but it's just proof that something can get done. And in my job, I feel like I often want to focus on those proof of concept. Here's the thing we can build on. What are the lessons we learned from this and how can we go forward? As opposed to, we've got to stop this and stop that and stop this at all, you know, whatever. That's important in my job too, important for us, but it cannot be our civic role to constantly be on the barricades, because that is going to turn the city, you know, into a ruin. It's going to miss the opportunity.
I think you're right. We're at an opportunity, and in fact, I'm going to put two questions together to that we're getting to pose to you. But I think it is an opportunity, and it is a shame that our planning and development processes are less and less involve local communities. And one of the questions is, isn't it time when we should be thinking more in our planning process of the weather change, all the you know, there's development being approved in the far Rockaways that will be flooded in 5 years or less or more. And we don't have planning per se in the city. We have zoning.
Right.
And this doesn't allow for the appropriate conversation between communities and the city, because the communities are just not listened to. They're just automatically described as, you know, anti-development, which is not true.
Right.
So isn't it time for climate change to come into this conversation?
Well, yes. And this is, of course, an issue with all development in the city. Certainly a lot of the proposals along the waterfronts. And, you know, I mentioned a proposal about the development of Governor's Island. And a lot of people are like, you know, Governor's Island is not a place where you should be building new things. That's a, you know, fundamental part of our conversation. Everything we do needs to be thought of in terms of its impact on the environment. And that's why I think this question of converting office buildings as opposed to just tearing down and building new ones, whether we're doing it now in the current economic environment or later, this is an important question. It's much more environmentally logical to try to preserve the structures we have and convert them than tear down and build anew. You know, I noticed in the questions, Ron Shipman asks a very good one, and I meant to say this, I just want to part of this trust question does, he says, what is really affordable? I was stumbling around that point when I said affordable, subsidized. Affordable is a catchword, which could mean basically that it's utterly unaffordable, an apartment in a neighborhood, especially in lower income neighborhoods. The affordable apartments are out of range for people who live there, and therefore they are going to change the economics of that neighborhood. This also has to be a fundamental part of the conversation up front. That word is one of those dodgy things that builds distrust, and it's used by developers and the city too, especially this mayor, to justify, supposedly affordable construction, which really isn't.
And they don't keep track of what we're losing. When you talk about people wanting protections, we are probably losing close to as many affordable units, protected units, as we are gaining. And one who can look at the conspiracy theory behind a lot of things, and I'm guilty of that, is, all this new housing, old housing, loss of housing is getting rid of rent stabilized apartments. It's been the real estate industry's goal for years. So it's so questionable that there's sincerity on the part of the need for affordable housing when we're not doing anything to protect the affordable housing we have. And
I mean, I think this mayor has tried to preserve, they often say to construct and preserve affordable housing, which is to keep, in other words, some of those units as affordable. That is a big issue, and it always has been, that we lose faster than we build. I don't know whether I'm not up on the latest numbers. Maybe somebody else is here.
Nobody's, the city's not keeping track. It's private organizations that are keeping track. The city doesn't want to know.
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is we need to build truly affordable apartments at a scale we have not even begun to do, and that is because the system doesn't. We dismantled the notion of public housing decades ago, beginning with Nixon, and we have a system for building affordable housing that is the crumbs left on the table. That's just unsustainable. And I'm not somebody, with COVID, I was not somebody who thought the city was now going to go to rack and ruin and nobody would live here. And, I think there are opportunities now with empty storefronts and with office buildings and so forth. But I'm not one of those who thinks, everyone's going to move away. And I never thought that. And I suspect it will take a while for the real estate market to recover, but not that long, which means affordability remains a crucial issue. But let's get back to where we started. Affordable communities, Jane Jacobs is knew this better than anybody else. A community is not a house. It's a whole ecosystem of streets and retail and services, schools, transportation. It's not just building units. And that's what we did for years, building public housing in the farthest corners of the city to dump the poor in places where they had no access to services and were a long way from jobs. And when we think about what we want to build in terms of housing, we need to also think about how that fits in with the larger urban agenda and how equitable that agenda is. So, I mean, I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted on this call, but this is something we cannot lose sight of. It's never just a number for housing, which is what I think this mayor was trying to sell. I've done X number of apartments. We have to get away from that kind of metric. We need a lot more, but that's not all we need.
He doesn't understand anyway. So, but there are a couple of interesting questions that relate to the fact is that we have younger generations now who have different interests and values than some of us old folk. They don't necessarily own cars. They don't want cars. And their idea of, what should be preserved is highly different. Breaks my heart when I see so many of them destroying the interior architecture of irreplaceable architecture of so many brownstones, apartments, lobbies, and whatever. But is there something that we're missing that can reach that younger generation and not adapt to their lifestyle? Because frankly, some of their lifestyle is totally car-based, which they should take to the suburbs and go and live and be happy. But the other is very bike-oriented.
Yeah, right.
And new-oriented, and a different culture in terms of storefronts.
Yeah.
We're not just talking about, the old Lower East Side Jewish delis. We're talking about the stores of a multitude of cultures. What is COVID teaching us about that, other than threatening a lot in terms of the storefronts, and at the same time, not totally acknowledging that there are new cultures and new age groups who say is not apparent.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think there has been a shift. And, look, I've never owned a car. I grew up in the village. I walked everywhere. I rode a bike. I'm not saying I'm virtuous. I'm just saying that's because it made sense. It was a way of living. I didn't need a car. It seemed like a burden. And again, I'm not saying it's because it's virtuous. It's what I loved about the city. It's because it's what I grew up with. I think for a lot of, you're right, that for many younger people, I guess younger, I don't know what that means really, but let's say under 60, because I think
younger than even you.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, no, I think the point is, sure, I do think there are millennials who have this attitude, but I think there are other people who are older too. The city, the joys of the city and the reasons to be here have partly to do with public transportation and walking and the life of the street. One just wants that to be functional. But it's also true that if we look at a lot of areas, including public housing projects and areas on the periphery of the city, there are people with cars who are not well-to-do. It's not that they're going to their second home. It's because there's no good public transportation, no other way of their getting to jobs and getting around. So it's not just a millennial sort of fad that we need bike lanes and bike bridges and so forth. We need to rethink the way people move about the city, because it's more equitable, and therefore it's what is going to make the city functional. And I think, personally, yes, some more people have got cars. There's always a churn of people coming and going out of the city. But I think probably, I like to think anyway, that the larger arc is a little like the national attitudes towards same-sex marriage. That it's, for a long time, it just seemed like, everybody felt one way, and there was a small coterie of progressives who felt another way, and then suddenly the sort of, even in red states, attitudes changed. And that was a generational thing, as you say, and it was just a cultural moment that shifted. I think that's happening here, if it hasn't already happened. And that will be crucial to moving the agenda forward on issues like those bike bridges. the last thing I want to say about bikes, because it's crucial, I mentioned these underserved areas. Part of the problem with the bike lobby, and I hope and assume there are some of them on this call too, is that, you know, it has, its face has been largely more white and affluent. I think one of the that isn't statistically reflective of how people of color and in underserved neighborhoods feel about riding bikes. But I think it's also that, you know, if you're biking from the distant part of the Bronx to Midtown to a job, it's kind of insane. It's impossible. And it's another thing if you're doing it from Park Slope, you know, to Brooklyn Heights or whatever. But the point is, if we, as I get back to this, if we begin to think about what a real bike network looks like and what e-bikes can do to make those trips plausible, these longer trips, then we're talking really about enlisting a much larger number of people who could be allies in this and would want this, and they're not necessarily 22-year-olds just out of, you know,
Right.
graduating from NYU.
I think that certainly makes sense. You know, we could spend a whole hour on, I can just, based on the questions, we could spend a whole nother hour just on cars, parking, pricing, and all of that. But there's another question that I think a number of people are concerned about: the empty storefronts. I think we're all concerned about the empty storefronts.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of reasons why they stay empty, which gets into a lot of legal, financial problems. But one of the things that I've noticed is we keep building suburban malls in the city. The World Trade Center, the whatchamacallit?
Hudson Yards.
No, that Hudson Yards for sure, but the World Trade, the Oculus, the old Gimbals, Penn Station now, Time Warner, Hudson Yards. Where is it possible that even under circumstances that present themselves, that people will be able to go back to store or will want to go to storefronts? And at the same time, I suspect that a lot of the things that have been happening during COVID, of people, unemployed people who have sort of started new businesses in their homes, are going to want to break out and go into storefronts. They're unaffordable. And yet at the same time, we're building malls. So where do we even raise that? That issue is not being discussed that I see.
It's an interesting question. Look, I mean, I think that, you know, the mall examples like the Oculus and Hudson Yards are really about the scandal there. The incredible scandal really is that these are on some level, you know, publicly funded shopping malls. And you know, at Hudson Yards, I mean, that seems like already seems like a catastrophic financial decision, and may, or you know, be converted into offices and other spaces because predictably no one was using it. I think, you know, I think on the whole, it's not that we're having the mallization of New York. I think those things represent not just an outmoded, but a really profound misunderstanding of the city, an offensive misunderstanding of the city that tries to turn New York into, you know, a suburb in order to create these little bubbles of wealth. But that's a slightly separate issue from the storefronts. So, you know, as far as the law is really complicated and I don't understand it all, but what I gather is that in many cases, you know, owners of storefronts are incentivized by getting tax breaks when these storefronts are empty. And I know this has come up, but this seems to me just, somebody here may be able to explain it to me. This seems to me insane to incentivize the, you know, the deadening of the street And to leave storefronts empty, I'm sure we can all look out our windows, those of us in New York, and see, as I can, if I look out this window here, empty storefronts, some of them empty for years. This is catastrophic. So certainly we do need to have a completely different, system to redo this. But I do think that now we can begin to reimagine a lot of these storefronts. I think you're right. Some of these commercial rents will drop. I think we can create, incentives for owners to allow in more pop-up stores, nonprofits, rethink what those spaces could be used for. I was in Berlin for some years. A lot of ground level, I don't know what to call them, but what I guess had been storefronts are used as, architectural offices or pop-up art gallery or whatever. People just want to feel that the street is activated. And the thing that proves it is that those 10,000 parking spaces given out to restaurants have created the realization that the city was alive, reactivated streets, reminded us that we are in this together, and that what we love about the city is that this is a vibrant, living place where we interact with each other. We have a civic compact, which is enacted in public space and on the streets. That's what those storefronts are a part of. So I think this is another, like perhaps a conversion of office buildings, defunct office buildings, a crucial opportunity now. Whatever it is, we have to get rid of this. Many areas are, not all, interestingly, some areas have really survived with their, on their retail strips. And I think that's because they're community-based, smaller, not banks and drugstores and chains. But obviously areas, and I'm near Broadway now, have been devastated.
There's no doubt about that. Well, we've gone over our time, as I fully expected. And I think we've raised as many questions as we've tried to answer, which is fine. It's all about the conversation in New York, which is part of what makes it so exciting. I personally want to thank you, Michael, but I want to turn it also over to Maria McDonald, who is the center's executive director, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Roberta.
Thank you. Here, Maria, it's up to you. You're on.
Well, okay, thank you both. I mean, I was riveted to that conversation. I lost track of time myself. I was writing notes and following such great questions in the Q&A as well. So to be continued. This is the first of our Jane Jacobs lectures. Michael and Roberta, what a wonderful way to kick this off for us and set the stage for a year of conversations post-COVID and issues that existed before COVID and now have become magnified and highlighted. And so we just wanted to invite everyone to join us again next month. We have another lecture. This one will be, I think she was mentioned, our second discussion in our Jane Jacobs lecture series explores the kind of opportunity post-COVID cities are, this time with the role of main streets through Mindy Thompson Full-Love's method that she writes about in her new book, Main Street, How a City's Heart Connects Us All. So you can register for this at the Center for the Living City. Again, it's free, and we would love all of you to come back and join us again for this conversation. Michael, you're welcome. I'm sure Roberta will be there and jump in and to stay a part of our conversation. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for your time. That was just terrific. Really, truly was. So much to think about.
Thank you all for tuning in and bearing with the frustration that your questions might not have been answered.
Sorry about that.
It was just wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay, everyone. See you next month. Okay. Bye-bye.